What's up, guys? Welcome to Anttech Airsoft Studios. Today we're hitting you with the product review on the Combat Union CNC Hop-Up Chamber for the ARES G36. That is the G36 made by ARES. What's up, Airsofters? This. Strap in, boys. The domain name changed, but the new intro won't be here for at least 90 business days. It's going to be impossible to talk about this aftermarket hop-up without talking about the air gun that it was intended for. The ARES G36 is OEM'd by ARES, so you can only imagine that you only have the finest quality parts in there out of the box. That is sarcasm. You do not have the finest quality parts out of the box. While the stock hop-up chamber kind of works, it is very picky with buckings, and it's not going to give you the same level of precision that you will get from a hop-up chamber made by Combat Union. So who is Combat Union? Combat Union is a small airsoft parts company based in Moscow, Russia, and they're most known in the US for their aftermarket AK hop-up chambers. They pretty much adopted the SVD style rotary wheel and applied that to the AK, ending the decades-long tradition of the stupid sliding adjustment arm that we all have grown to settle with. They make a hop-up chamber for the ARES G36. You can't get more niche than that. It's very interesting that out of all the companies, this is the one that actually went out of their way to make an improvement for this specific gun. Similar to all the other hop-up chambers manufactured by Combat Union, the ARES G36 hop-up is made of a precise CNC construction. It does use a rotary wheel, and it also comes included with a double O-ring CNC nozzle that should be the ideal fitment for the ARES G36. But we're going to talk about nozzle fitment in this review, so don't you worry about that. Full disclosure on this review and this product and my relationship with Combat Union. So this all started with me taking in a customer build that happens to be an ARES G36. We had originally ordered this hop-up chamber from Gray Shop, which is a retail store that is based in Russia. We paid for it, they took the money, we got tracking that did not work and it never arrived. Somehow I got in contact with Combat Union about this, and they reached out to Gray Shop and they got nothing. So I was sent this hop-up chamber for free on the condition that I do a video review for this hop-up. So the reason why we're filming this today and the reason why you're watching this is because that is part of the agreement of Combat Union being gracious enough to send us this free unit to kind of fix Gray Shop's mistake. I was also sent this little baggie of flat nubs that Combat Union makes to test out. They're pretty much modified flat nubs as far as their dimensions, but they come in different hardnesses, so that's kind of neat. We can use a squishy one and pretty much get the effect of an M-nub in a traditional chamber. As far as any other affiliation I have with Combat Union, there is none. Every other time I've used the Combat Union chamber in the past, the customer had either managed to get their hands on it and provided it for the build, or I was able to snag one from a US-based retailer that happened to have them in stock. With that said, I would love in the future to be able to carry Combat Union hop-ups, specifically their AK hop-ups, but that's really tricky. Them being based in Russia makes certain things like payment a little sketchy. Otherwise, I would love to stock their products because I think that they do make a very good product. After everything is assembled and we talked about compatibility, we get it all figured out, we start doing our testing and flexing of the complete gun. Then I'll be able to really give my opinions on it and tell you if I recommend the product. And additionally, I'll be able to tell you if I recommend this path altogether, insofar as using the ARES G36 as a base for this build. Time warp into the future. This build is taking a long time and there's reasons for that. But as mentioned earlier, I can't get into the review for the hop-up until we actually talk about the gun that this is all going into. So I'm going to leave the parts that are actually going into this build in the description so you can actually look at the itemized list. But what I want to talk about right now is what you have to do to an ARES G36 to actually build it up to perform like a premium gun. The ARES G36 is a Make-A-Wish kid that needs a ton of organ transplants. Fortunately, I donated my G36 to science so that we can make this ARES G36 based. These guns out of the factory come with a proprietary micro switch cutoff lever system, and it's not going to be drop-in compatible with all the other TM Spec G36s out on the market. In other words, that means you cannot put a Gate Titan or Jefftron Leviathan in the stock ARES gearbox. For this build, we're using the Retro Arms V3 shell. And in order to fit that in the ARES G36, there's several parts we'll have to salvage from a TM Spec G36. You're going to need the TM Spec selector plate as well as the TM Spec mounting bracket. The mounting bracket that comes in the ARES is only compatible with their proprietary micro switch gearbox shell. I really recommend changing out the motor cage as well. The one that comes in the gun is made of paper mache, and I really recommend changing out the motor cage as well. The one that comes in the gun is made of a really cheap cast metal. It flexes, it's not easy to get motor alignment on it. So we opted for the CNC SHS Motor Cage. There's not a lot of motor cages on the market. I really wish that Retro Arms made one. We had to do a lot of modifications to the SHS motor cage, and with that said, we're going to talk about the modifications to do this conversion. Starting with the motor cage, I had to drill and tap a second hole on the bottom of it to prevent the two halves from splitting when fully assembled. I also had to glue gearbox shims to the gearbox shell where the motor cage actually kind of locks in, because it was originally a very loose fit, and when you tighten those screws down all the way, you can still wobble the motor cage. That mod also required using longer screws to actually reach the threads on the other end of the gearbox shell. As far as fitting the motor inside of there, I had to make a smaller collar for it to actually let the motor sit at the proper angle. And in order to actually fix it to that angle, I had to use aluminum tape inside the motor cage, both around the top of the can and also towards the bottom of the end bell. And then I was able to actually adjust the beveled pinion, and I was testing that by using an external circuit with the motor and the bevel. Then I discovered that the original motor plate actually doesn't line up properly with the new motor cage, so I had to make a custom motor plate. After making my motor plate that had the holes in the right spot, I discovered when I put it on, the beveled pinion sounded worse. Then I discovered that because of all the mods we had to do to the motor cage and the motor to get good beveled pinion and motor alignment and all that stuff, turns out that it actually has to be cocked to the side. So I had to go to the design, and this plate is unique to this specific gun's situation. These holes are lined up, but they're also off-center. They don't line up with the holes that actually screw into the grip. The additional modification I had to make had everything to do with the Retro Arm shell actually not being as G36 compatible as it's advertised. I had to make a cut to the outside of the shell to make room for the selector plate to move freely. I also had to modify the selector plate so that I don't remove too much material from the shell in that spot. The channel inside the selector plate that engages with the selector switch also had to be cut deeper so that it would be compatible with the ARES. Another time warp. The selector plate broke, so I just redesigned the selector plate from scratch, and I added reinforcements, and I printed it, and that's what we have in the gun now. ADD brake. So we got the gearbox together, she's shooting well. Now we can really dive into the review for the Hop Up unit itself. There's three aspects I want to discuss. First being the air nozzle, second being the Hop Up unit, and thirdly, I want to talk about the Magwell portion of the Hop Up unit and how that plays with the rest of the gun. To check if the nozzle is too short, I did a really old trick that I've been doing for years. You basically get the whole gearbox together, piston assembly, compression, tappet plate, tappet spring, all that. You want your tappet plate all the way forward, you want your piston all the way forward with the spring in the gearbox, and then you put your Hop Up assembly in here. Then you take a piece of macro line from a Polar Star or any HPA engine, you can actually stick that down the inner barrel and you can blow into that tube. And you will feel and hear if there's an air leak. To my surprise, we got perfect air seal. Like, the nozzle is actually the appropriate length. I didn't have to sand down the tappet plate or anything like that. So that's a really good thing. As far as, is the nozzle too long? Well, if the nozzle's too long, the main issue that can cause is twofold. One, it's gonna push the BB way too far down the Hop Up chamber, and it's going to cause a lot of FPS inconsistencies. We didn't see that at all when we were chronoing this, so that's good. The other thing that can happen when your nozzle is too long is that when it's all the way back, you're not allowing enough clearance for your BB to get into the Hop Up chamber. You can check that by just feeding a mag on full auto or semi-auto or whatever have you. This thing fed flawlessly. There was honestly no issues with it. So as far as the nozzle goes, length and dimensions were all there. Another part of the nozzle that's really important to talk about are the O-rings in it. This nozzle has 2 O-rings in it. Now there's other nozzles on the market that have 2 O-rings, such as the Max nozzle, but what Combat Union did really well with this is they made those 2 O-rings a little bit more separated from one another. So while it gives you that extra air seal that 2 O-rings will give you, you're also preventing the nozzle from being able to wobble around back and forth by having those O-rings act as stabilizers across 2 different points on the spout of the cylinder head. And it just makes it really solid. Honestly, I don't think mid-cap syndrome is going to be an issue with this at all. The nozzle fit really well on the ASG or low neck cylinder head that we're using, and it also fit really well in the garter tappet plate that we're using. Everything's nice and firm and snug, but we don't have a ton of friction between the nozzle and the cylinder head. Honestly, the nozzle is perfect. I wouldn't change anything about it for this build. All right, we warped to the benchtop view so I can show you how this all assembles. Really quickly, we're using a PDI 601 barrel, R-hopped with an Elvish tack batch, and we're using a Modify flat bucking. I'm gonna slide this guy in here, just like that. There is silicone on there, so that's important. We're gonna use the C-clip. Little word on the C-clip, there does appear to be a little defect here in the materials used. It doesn't look like tooling that caused that crack, but it's there. Nonetheless, it's still rigid enough to work. That's going to lock the inner barrel into the hop-up chamber via the grooves on the side. Now we can put in the nub and the adjustment arm. Here's the flat nub provided by Combat Union. Like I said before, it's kind of like a Modify flat nub, but this is really squishy and it reminds me of an M nub, and I really like that. So we can swing this arm down, and then we can take the adjustment wheel, which you can clearly see how this would work. And we're gonna put that over there. So the next part is going to be this portion right here. This is gonna do 2 things. First thing it's gonna do is it's going to prevent the C-clip from backing out, which if it did back out, it would cause your inner barrel to twist side to side and make BBs not go straight, but it'll make them hook to one side or the other. The other thing that it does is it prevents the actual adjustment wheel from sliding off from where it came from. Next is the spring. I'm not a huge proponent of using springs to push the hop up against the gearbox, but for this gun it's necessary. You need the spring in order to install it onto the upper receiver because it has to go in at an angle and then twist and then lock. Secondly, you need it to be able to spring a little bit in order to install the lower receiver / gearbox into the upper receiver. So that's the hop up chamber. Now it's really important to discuss the whole Magwell situation. So here's the stock hop up chamber. And if you compare this to the Combat Union design, Combat Union includes this plate that goes on the bottom, and you can see how these are very different. When you look at the Magwell for the ARES, you can see that it's meant to fit right in there, and it's supposed to guide that nozzle. Turns out, if you don't use this plate and you install everything like this, it actually feeds flawlessly. The only issue with that is that despite it feeding flawlessly, because of the lack of material here, because this plate was made, while you get that in there correctly, there's still like a slight gap, and that can cause things to move, like your Magwell and this, and it could present some FPS consistency problems, maybe even feeding problems. My solution to this was just to 3D print a replacement plate. This still has the bottom portion here that does help guide the nozzle, but what it does allow is for you to not have to modify this Magwell to where it'll still fit in there, like so, and everything should work great. We can't install this until we put everything back into the gun. Zooming out a little bit, I'm going to show you how this installs into the gun. It goes in just like the original one. You're going to get that back open. This is going to go into the outer barrel. Once you line it up, it'll slide right in. So you put it in sideways, you push it in, and then it rotates, and then it locks. Now it can still spring back and forth. And ARES actually came up with a solution for this as far as making this not affect air seal. There's a grub screw on the top here that you will actually tighten, and that will prevent this from springing back and forth. But before we do that, we're gonna have to put in our gearbox. So right now you can see that this gearbox won't go in all the way until I move this hop-up chamber out of the way. And now everything goes in as it should. So once you get that plate in, now you can kind of look at this gun from the side, and you can push that hop-up chamber as far up into that gearbox as you can get it. And while holding it there, you're going to take your Allen key and you're going to tighten that grub screw on the top that I talked about. And that's actually going to lock the hop-up chamber in place and prevent it from shifting back and forth. And another time warp. When it got all assembled and I was ready to actually chrono it, test fire it and whatnot, it wasn't feeding. Now I had mentioned earlier that without the plate on the bottom of the hop-up chamber, the gun actually fed flawlessly. After adding my own plate to it, now we had a more restricted path for the BB to actually get into the hop-up chamber. So it was no longer lining up with the hole in the Magwell. So the way that I compensated for this was by using a couple of hop-up shims that go in between the hop-up chamber and the gearbox, and this actually allowed the hole to line up so that the BBs can feed properly. Fortunately, the nozzle is still long enough, despite pushing the hop-up away, to reach the bucking and still make a full seal. So I can confidently say that we now have a fully functioning, upgraded, based ARES G36. We're going to talk about performance, and then I'll give you my final thoughts on everything. The hop-up chamber, honestly, I'll say it right off the bat, it is a phenomenal hop-up chamber. Combat Union honestly never disappoints me. I think they did a great job with this, and while I did have to make a custom plate for the bottom of it, and I did have to use a couple hop-up shims to offset it so that it would align with the Magwell, all in all, those are kind of things that I expect when I build any gun. I might have to do little tweaks like that to get things to work. As far as being an end user and just wanting a drop-in solution, I wouldn't say that this is necessarily a drop-in solution, but I would say that the extra effort to get it working is absolutely worth it. If it wasn't for this hop-up chamber, the ARES G36 would not be worth working on at all. You could do everything you want to the gearbox, but at the end of the day, that stock hop-up chamber is pretty lackluster, and it's just going to end up being another one of those guns in your collection that has that weird quirk, and you know what that quirk is, and you only really use it because you like G36s, but you know that you'd probably be more effective with your M4. So with that said, I want to get into some specifics about the hop-up chamber and just kind of give a rating, I guess. It locks the barrel in very well. It is not extremely picky with buckings, which is a really good thing. The arm is not weird and wobbly. It's actually really firm, and once you set that adjustment, it's going to stay put. The flat nubs that Combat Union provided are actually phenomenal, and throughout the process of filming this review, I had used the other two flat nubs in a couple other builds, and in every single one of those flat nubs performed extremely well. As far as like the air seal and FPS consistency and all that stuff, this hop-up chamber is doing a lot to help that air seal and compression. We chronoed this with BLS 0.25 gram BBs, and we took 20 shots. And within those 20 shots, we had a 3.7 deviation between the minimum reading and the maximum reading. Generally, when I'm building all these different weird guns that aren't as straightforward as M4s, and they're a bit harder to get that perfect air seal with, I find that if you can get the gun shooting under a 5 FPS deviation in 20 shots, it's generally acceptable, and you're really not going to notice much of a difference when you're actually using the gun out on the field. So the fact that this is below that standard that I've come to use over the years is actually pretty exceptional considering what this gun is. Range-wise, I was able to comfortably hit man-sized targets at around 200 to 250 feet using 0.32 gram BBs. I wasn't able to really film the range test because at the time of filming, it's extremely windy outside. And it's just going to be a really difficult thing to kind of capture on camera, especially considering there's snow on the ground over here. You're not really going to be able to see the BBs all that well. But despite the wind, I was able to tilt the gun a little bit to have the hop-up work against the wind and get me a straight trajectory. And in doing that, I was pretty much back in business. I was able to still hit those targets at those ranges, and all was good with the world. Now, I'm gonna let you guys in on my thoughts on whether or not I think that this is even the right path to take if you want a G36 that's upgraded. Like I said before, if it weren't for this hop-up chamber, this build would not be worth it at all. you could do everything you want to the gearbox, but the stock hop-up chamber really is lackluster, and ultimately it's just not going to be able to perform at that higher tier that you would kind of want if you're dumping all that money into your gun. If you live in the United States, there's the KWA G36, there's the JG G36, and there's also now the TM NGRS G36. As of filming this, I have no experience with the TM NGRS G36. I do know that they make a G36K variant for the NGRS, and if it's anything like the other NGRSs out there, it's going to be a pretty phenomenal gun, and if you're willing to put a little bit of work into it, you can get it shooting up to that standard that we have here in the US, where the FPS limits are a bit high and the ranges are a bit further. But as far as like the JG and the KWA, those are pretty much TM spec, and I think that you're going to have a much easier time upgrading those to get them to perform at this level. Now with those G36s, you're not really going to be using the Combat Union hop-up, although I kind of suspect that you can probably make this hop-up work in those G36s with a couple custom parts. It's something I might look into in the future. I do think that if I had to choose between KWA, JG, this, or an NGRS, I'd probably pick an NGRS because I think the recoil is cool and I'm willing to work on it. If I had to choose one based off of what would probably be the cheapest to upgrade to get it performing similar to this, I'd probably pick the JG. And then if you just want that next step up in external quality, I would say the KWA. As far as this goes though, if somebody wanted me to work on one of these again, I absolutely would, but I would only do it under the condition that we basically do exactly what I did to this one. There's really not a single corner that you can cut on this build, unfortunately, because ARES is just dog shit. But you can still make a built gun with this, which is something that I appreciate. It was a good challenge, and it's a gun that I'm really glad to be done with, that I can get back to the customer and he can be really happy with it. With that said, guys, that pretty much concludes this review. I just want to say a big thank you to Combat Union for, again, being so gracious to send this hop-up unit over for free. This build wouldn't have happened without that generosity, and I really would like to be able to carry some combat stuff in the future. I'll see what I can do to kind of make that happen. If you guys haven't already, subscribe to this YouTube channel, hit that bell notification so you can see every time I upload a video. You can follow me on Instagram at anttech.airsoft, or you can come visit me here at Zulu 24 Airsoft Park. Come to my window and we can chit chat, or I can fix your gun, or you can drop off a gun to be worked on. If you guys are interested in any tech work, you can go over to anttechAirsoft.com, go over to our tech services page, and follow the instructions that are on that page. Typically, the process will start with a consultation so that we can kind of meet and figure out what we want to do with your build, and then we kind of just get the ball rolling from there. So if that's something you're interested in, absolutely go check that out. Guys, thank you so much for watching this video. I hope Combat Union appreciates the review. I really don't care what ARES thinks at all about this review. Like, comment, subscribe, do all that good stuff. Thank you, good night, God bless, and I'm out.